Today we're going to be covering a case study on persistent fatigue, very debilitating fatigue, allergies. This patient was breaking out in hives and had, hay fever symptoms, 10 out of 10, and also inflamed skin. And when she was really in a flare, she was dealing with a persistent body rash that would kind of escalate to red, weepy, inflamed skin. So we'll cover the recommendations, lab testing, we're going to cover the lab results here today, and also where we maintain therapies and where we pivoted to see those improvements that we were looking for. So before we jump in, so important, this is education only. I don't know your case, this is very specific to this patient. So work with a skilled practitioner. And if you're living in Australia or New Zealand and you're dealing with digestive health or chronic illness, reach out to the clinic and we'll see if we can help out. So when this patient first presented to the clinic, she was dealing with a whole laundry list of symptoms. So the really kind of significant ones were eczema. She would have been dealing with that from a very young age. She had some food intolerances, but I was looking for more extreme food intolerances, particularly with the lab results. She was tolerating food more than I would have expected. She was also dealing with quite persistent and debilitating fatigue. She had night sweats as well, kind of couldn't sleep because of the night sweats some nights. And the most kind of extreme symptom that was most kind of concerning for her was that she would, experience this rash, this body rash. When she was really flaring, it would kind of cover her skin and it would take months to resolve. And at its worst, it would kind of develop all the way to a red, weepy skin. So very, very concerning for her. And that was really the kind of number one drive. That was the primary symptom that she wanted to get on top of. So straight off the cuff with a chronic complex presentation like this patient, I order and recommend organic acids testing all the time. This is like a must for this case. Whenever there's a question, whenever it's kind of complex, whenever it's this persistent kind of unclear presentation, if it's something that's been going on for a year or two, maybe 10 years, maybe, a patient's whole life, we're ordering out tests. It's 100% worth the money and the investment for most people. And this is a classic example. This case, we ordered the out test. It told us what we needed. We used that data to make recommendations, and then we tracked progress as she improved. Now, the out test that I recommend, I'm very firm on this, is Mosaic Labs. They used to be called Great Plains Labs. They've recently changed their name. And it just has a few very specific, very kind of unusual markers. You're not going to find these in other out tests, and I've come to really rely on them. Doesn't mean that those markers always pop, but when they do, it's something you don't want to be missing. Now, the problem here in Australia, and it's not the case if you're watching this in the States, is that getting these results takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So patients say, look, let's order the lab, I'll check back in with you when we have the results and we'll get started on a plan. That's not my preference. My preference is to get the lab out of the way, which is what I recommended for this patient, and then start on what I call the maintenance plan. And this is based on my clinical intuition, the patient's history, what I kind of suspect is going on. And the big goal here with this maintenance plan is to go in gently. We're not going in aggressively because we don't know what we're treating yet. Again, I have my suspicions with this case. I suspected fungal, from half an hour into the initial consult, I was pretty darn sure that she was either dealing with a fungal overgrowth in her body, like Candida, or maybe even mold, aspergillosis. That's what I was kind of looking for. Or she had been exposed to mold in the environment. She was dealing with this kind of sick building syndrome. So the big goal with the maintenance plan is just to kind of smooth things out while we're waiting for lab results to come back. And so I recommended 4 different products. Top of the top here for this patient was quercetin at decent doses. And I recommended this because it's a pretty potent mast cell stabilizer, and it also helps to detoxify histamine as well. It's a potent antioxidant kind of globally. And so I strongly suspected that histamine was a driver here. and quercetin's a really great place to start. Second recommendation here, favorite probiotic for a certain case, this case specifically, Saccharomyces boulardii, for more reasons than I can list. I mean, the top three there, number one, it can help to kind of heal the gut lining. It's antifungal, so I was suspecting a Candida picture there. And the third big piece is that Saccharomyces boulardii can actually help to bind and eliminate mycotoxins out of the body. It's not something that most people kind of think about when they think about probiotics, but they can be gentle but quite effective, binders, again, specifically for mold byproducts, mycotoxins. Third big recommendation, probably not a surprise to you if you've been watching for a while, would be partially hydrolyzed guar gum, or PHGG. This is a low FODMAP, soluble prebiotic. It's very well tolerated by most people. If you go in low and slow and you build up to therapeutic doses, here it was a tablespoon a day, it helps to rebalance the microbiome, which has a knock-on effect of healing up the gut lining. It's antifungal, it can normalize bowel movements. Working on rebalancing that microbiome has a lot of knock-on effects. It's a really great place to start. It's very, very gentle, and most patients can tolerate it. Now, the fourth recommendation here for the maintenance plan would be targeted B vitamins, and we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty here about why, but I strongly suspected that she was dealing with a fungal overgrowth and maybe mold exposure in the environment. And what happens there is that your body has to work overtime to detoxify and to get things out of the body. And most of these enzymes run on B vitamins, different B vitamins. So really big ones there for her, B1, B2, B3, maybe even B9, B12, around that kind of methylation, B6, that transsulfuration side of things as well. Really potent kind of detox pathway, builds glutathione and your bile acids. The B vitamins, if you are under toxic load, you can be burning through them because those detox enzymes can be working a lot harder than they normally do. So the two enzymes that I was most concerned about with this patient, number one would be aldehyde dehydrogenase, and that's one of the last enzymes in the histamine detox pathway. And I strongly suspected histamine overload and histamine intolerance was part of her picture. It was almost a given. Patients will tell you that. Hay fever was 10 out of 10. She had skin issues, brain fog, fatigue. It's starting to look like a histamine intolerant patient. And supporting that last little step, if it is a fungal overgrowth, and if I was right, then that enzyme tends to get overworked, burns through a lot of these cofactors, so it doesn't have the kind of fuel to make the enzyme work properly, and then you get a buildup of a very toxic metabolite of histamine. The second really big enzyme that I was concerned about there was pyruvate dehydrogenase, and this is the entry point into the Krebs cycle, right? And it's the first step of like effective and efficient cellular energy production, right? So the mitochondria, they're like your powerhouses of the cell. And if you have issues with pyruvate dehydrogenase, that enzyme that shunts that glucose into pyruvate into the Krebs cycle, it's going to go a different way, and you're going to get very inefficient cellular energy production. It's not going to run as well as it should, and that would be a really big piece around that persistent fatigue. And again, we're going to look at the OAT test and see if I was on track. So we ordered off the OAT test, got her on the maintenance plan. She worked with that for about 4 to 6 weeks. Lab results came in and we had a little check-in. And the first question that I have when we have a check-in is, how much have you seen improvements? Even before we jump into lab results, are we on the right track? How much have you seen an improvement in the maintenance plan? And this is where we get confirmation on tolerance of products. Are they tolerated or not? The extremely sensitive patients, they're reacting to everything. They're reacting to water. Some patients will drink water and they'll bloat up to 6-9 months pregnant, bloated, visibly distended. So if you're reacting to water, there's a chance you might be reacting to some of these nutraceuticals and supplements and herbs that we'll be talking about later. But thankfully, the patient had seen an almost 70% improvement in her symptoms globally. Everything was up off her baseline and she was getting huge improvements. This is uncommon. I would not be looking for a 70% improvement in a chronic, complex patient who's been dealing with these symptoms for years over 4 to 6 weeks. Like, that was a slam dunk. And that just shows when you have a theory and you're confirming it with a simple plan, it's very binary. It's either, one, are you tolerating it or not? And then two, are you seeing improvements? And if you are seeing improvements, even without looking at the labs, which we're going to look at now, you want to persist with that treatment, that foundation. You're building that foundation until you plateau. And I can't tell you, it's embarrassing. It took me years to learn that. I was always looking for the next step and looking to kind of compound the improvements. Time is that variable that you really need to lean on. So if over 4 to 6 weeks a patient has seen significant improvements, persist with that same treatment, double down and see, can we get more improvements, or have we plateaued at that 70% and we need, the next leg of treatment to be discussed. So let's jump into the out test results. I could spend hours talking about this, which I won't. I won't bore you with the details. It is very complex. It is very comprehensive. I'm learning something new about this lab every week, and it has really changed the face of my practice. You can look under the hood with kind of biochemistry and where things are imbalanced and where things are kind of overloaded. And again, this case is a prime example of the insights that it can provide. So any marker in this little orangey yellow bar is typical, it's average. There's some nuances there, but we'll keep it simple. Anything above or below that orange yellow bar up to the whiskers, or below to the bottom whisker, there's an example there, would be starting to become less common. And then the really big piece, anything that is above, frankly above that whisker and outlined in red, it is moving into the 95th percentile, meaning that less than 5% of the sample selection that they have had a number that deranged or that abnormal. And so we'll just pick out the really significant ones for this case. Number 7, we've got the fungal overgrowth. This is invasive Candida, 45. The upper limit's 29. This is, moderate, mild to moderate. I was definitely looking for more. It is showing us that it is a fungal overgrowth as suspected. But number 7, arabinose, it's the most commonly elevated organic acid. So I, again, was looking for that to be more elevated up into the hundreds. That's becoming quite severe. And I think the worst I've ever seen was 700. And that's unheard of. That was off the charts by a long shot. Moving down to number 11, 2-hydroxyphenylacetic acid, mildly elevated. Again, I would not spend too much time on this one. Upper limit 0.66, she's at 0.72, little bit of bacterial dysbiosis, but that was suspected. If we move on down to the second page, we're looking for the story. We're looking for the OAT test to tell us more, tell us a story, multiple markers telling us the same thing. And number 20 is significantly elevated glycolic acid, 400. The upper limit's 117. And so she's not quite, but she's close to 4 times the upper limit. And this is extreme. You don't normally see this. And you also don't normally see number 20 high and number 21 oxalic acid low or normal there. And the big piece here is that glycolic acid is a few steps above in that oxalic acid detox pathway. And normally you'd see both of these elevated and we'd say, look, you're just dealing with an oxalate overload. And number 20 is just saying you're having trouble with some of the enzymes that help break it down. Could be a B6 deficiency, or it could just be that pathway running red hot. What I'm suspecting with this patient with 20 elevated and 21 not is a fungal overgrowth. And again, number 7, it was mildly elevated. We're looking for more of a picture there, more of a story. And if we're looking at number 20, elevated, number 21 normal. I am thinking and suspecting more and more fungal overgrowth in the body or mold exposure in the environment or both. And so the other explanations here with elevated glycolic acid could have been a genetic presentation of hyperoxaluria, which I didn't suspect. I've only seen that twice in my career. It's pretty uncommon. And it could also be nutrient deficiencies, which again, I have suspected. That's why we put her on the B vitamins. And so B6 is a really big one here. B1 is a big one here, or magnesium, and strong deficiencies in those can block that conversion from glycolic acid over to oxalic acid. Let's move on down through. And again, we're just picking out the really big ones. Mitochondrial markers. This is the Krebs cycle right here. Pretty messed up. There's some issues here. Succinic acid is elevated, fumaric acid is significantly elevated, malic acid's elevated, 2-oxyglutaric acid, somewhat elevated, and citric, frankly elevated. It's just showing us that her ability to, produce cellular energy is compromised, which wasn't a surprise. And I wouldn't spend any time directly treating this, treating the root cause, the fungal overgrowth, and making sure symptoms are improving. So on both sides, root cause, symptom improvement, and we would be looking for the mitochondria to come back online when we've dealt with that root cause, which is fungal overgrowth. So if we're moving down through the OAT test, let's pick out some more significant pieces. We've got the neurotransmitter metabolites, her dopamine, HVA, that's a metabolite of dopamine, was moderately elevated. Dopac, that's a dopamine metabolite again, right on the cusp into the 95th percentile, 1.8, she was 1.8. And those were really the significant pieces there. And these are stress neurotransmitters, right? It's the sympathetic dominant nervous system that I would be focusing on. And it's just telling us that she's under stress, which she told me when she came in. This is not a surprise. So if we're moving on down through, again, her B9's looking good. I'm not concerned about this. Her ability to metabolize fatty acids is looking good down here. Adiptic and subaric and sebacic, they're all looking good. Nutritional markers, everything's looking a little bit needing of support. The big one here to recognize these little asterisks is anything that's elevated here, and we're going to get to B2 in a second with those asterisks, anything elevated is signifying a deficiency in that nutrient. So methylmalonic acid, it is a very sensitive B12 marker, and she is tracking away from quality B12. She needs B12. It's not frankly elevated, but this again, we want to catch this early. B12 is huge, huge, huge. The other really big ones, again, B6, these are not robust markers. Number 51, 52, vitamin C, it is always lab low. It's just not a good way of measuring vitamin C. Totally ignore that. That's not a problem. But again, the big one that jumps out is B2. Very, very robust marker, glutaric acid, and it is significantly elevated, which means she is significantly deficient in B2. What is the significance there? There are so many detox enzymes and enzymes in the body in general that run on B2. The biggest one, the most kind of concerning one here, and the one that we want to really kind of pay attention to, is the MTHFR enzyme, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, right? And everyone's talking a lot about that as like a genetic SNP, right? You might have the MTHFR kind of single nucleotide polymorphism, homozygous, heterozygous, whatever it is, and that's running slower, right? So genetically that's running slower. If you do not have sufficient B2 riboflavin in the body, that enzyme is going to grind to a halt. Her ability to methylate and to convert the preformed kind of B9 into methylfolate, to methylate B9, to spin into the methylation cycle and to do all those wonderful things like build and detoxify, is compromised, right? It doesn't have the cofactor B2 to run efficiently and properly. And so we don't want to sleep on this one at all. The upper limit 0.36, she's 0.884. This is quite significantly deficient in B2. So let's move on down to the last page. This is a really significant part of the lab. Indicators of detoxification. We've got markers on glutathione. We've got markers on that transsulfuration pathway, markers on ammonia. This is elevated, and remember that's a little asterisk, meaning it's deficient. And so she is starting to kind of tap out on that master antioxidant. Glutathione is essential to eliminate toxins out of the body. And again, this is another kind of tick in that column of the fungal and the mold exposed patient. Number 59, again, elevated, not significant, but we don't want to ignore this one. It's showing that the body is trying to detoxify, right? So number 58, it's a pretty simple marker. It just says, look, how much glutathione do you have? How much of that pool of glutathione is available? Number 59 is more, how much is the body trying to detoxify? How much is it pulling on that pathway to build glutathione to detoxify? The higher that is, the more it's a marker of toxic exposure. She's got a little bit of ammonia excess. Again, I think this is a symptom or kind of a consequence of a lot of the root causes that we talked about, that fungal overgrowth, and no issues with salicylates. And again, this is a huge value of this organic acids test because a lot of her symptoms could have just been a salicylate intolerance, right? And so we've run this lab. It does get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes there is a salicylate intolerance, and even when it's negative, we treat it and people get better. But I would not spend a lot of time and money and effort on getting that salicylate pathway working properly. It doesn't look like that's our root cause. Now, the last important piece on this oat test is markers of B1 deficiency, and right here we've got 62. And we've also got 64. And you might say to me, ooh, look, they're looking normal. Ideally, you want most of these amino acid metabolites to be stacked up here on the left. That's typical, that's healthy, that's normal. And even these transient elevations here, number 64 being at 1.2, that this is quite significant. And again, I would be thinking of B1 deficiency. Before we move on, I just wanted to stop. Thank you for being here. I know it's kind of in-depth. It might be overwhelming, but if you're getting something out of this, then remember to subscribe. And if you're in Australia or New Zealand and you're dealing with digestive health symptoms, chronic, complex issues, reach out to us here at the Byron Herbalist Clinic. There'll be a link in the description below. So we've got the oat test results, and the big question is, what were the recommendations from there? And the big mistake that I see being made frequently with oat test results is getting a recommendation for each of the markers that are abnormal. And if you were doing that, you would lose the signal. You would just be taking too many supplements and it would become too noisy, and you wouldn't know if what you were recommending was doing what it should. And so the two additions that I recommended from here, again, keep up with that maintenance plan because she was doing so well. Layer on these two new additions. Number one was more antioxidant support. And here it was a choice between liposomal glutathione or N-acetylcysteine, NAC, NAC. Both of them build glutathione. One of them is just straight glutathione. The other one is NAC, the cysteine. Again, that goes down to build glutathione. And we opted here to go for liposomal glutathione. There is some issues around mold exposure and NAC getting converted to glutathione. That's way too complicated for this video. It's what did we do? Boots on the ground. And liposomal glutathione can be hard for some patients to tolerate. So the big recommendations, write it out in the treatment plan, have a discussion about it, make sure it's understood, is to go low and slow. The second big recommendation here was an antifungal herbal medicine, and here the choice was a combo encapsulated product, which was an option. The other choice would have been a tincture, which most of my patients get, whole herbs extracted into water and alcohol to target that fungal overgrowth. Again, I love that approach. But the option that we went with for this patient was one single antifungal herb called Horopedo. It's a brand called Colorex. There'll be a link in the description below. You can run it by your practitioner. And that is a potent antifungal. Now, why did we choose that one on its own? Now, I was concerned about reactivity. I was concerned she definitely wouldn't tolerate the herbal tincture, right? There's alcohol in there, there's a lot of herbs in there, there's a lot that she could have reacted to. She had histamine symptoms. She was doing well, so we didn't want to compromise those improvements. The combo encapsulated antifungals, that was an option, but I think keep it really simple. Keep one herb, and if you're reacting to that product, we know it's not rocket science. You just don't tolerate Horopedo, pause it, put it in the cupboard, work with everything else, get all those detox pathways working, get that mast cell stabilized, get the nutrients built up, and then we can bring that one back in and see if you tolerate it later on. So we updated the maintenance plan, sent her on her way. She worked with that for 4 to 6 weeks, checked back in, and again, she had seen more improvement from that 70%. She was, subjectively reporting about an 85% improvement globally. And this is uncommon. Chronic, complex, patients who have been unwell for years, decades, sometimes their whole life. It tends to, they might improve and then regress, and they might react to a product, and we've got to fiddle with this product and drop that one and pause this and stabilize. It can become a very hands-on process. It's uncommon to see, improvements from the get-go and just sustained improvements. And again, that's the value of the oat test. It told us what she needed, we recommended it, she tolerated it, and she saw improvements. So from there, a few symptoms were just struggling to see the same improvements. The really big one there were the night sweats. So I recommended a magnesium glycinate. Magnesium and glycine, they're both very calming to the nervous system. Glycine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Her dopamine was pretty high. So we're just trying to kind of calm that down while we work on supplying the nutrients to help detoxify dopamine. And the other really big one there, over time, and this is probably like 2 or 3 months after she started liposomal glutathione, we swapped in N-acetylcysteine and we dropped the liposomal glutathione. The big piece there is, NAC has other benefits. It can break up biofilms, it's a mucolytic, but it is also a lot more affordable as well. So a little bit more of a long-term strategy. Drop the glutathione, which can be a bit pricey over time. It does what it needed to do. We've worked through that. We're detoxifying things out. And then the big piece here, because we don't always get it right, is if you make that swap and symptoms start to regress and you start to flare a bit, it's not rocket science. Swap back in the liposomal glutathione for a bit longer, shelf the NAC, and when you're ready, try that swap again. So the big question that you might have is, why did I suspect a fungal overgrowth? And I've got a video on that you can check out here.